In just a few short weeks, Anthology Together is bringing you the best of ed tech at the Walt Disney World Swan and Dolphin Resort in Orlando, Florida. Join the global education community to hear about what's next in the future of learning, get a firsthand look at the latest innovations, and discover new insights to help both your institution and students achieve their goals. The future of learning is here, and there's no better place to see it than at Anthology Together 2022. The event kicks off on July 11th, so register today at www.anthology.com/together. The Alliance for Innovation and Transformation is an alliance of pacesetters, forward-thinking higher education CEOs committed to leading by example to show other higher education institutions how to innovate and transform their organizations in the face of unprecedented challenge and change. They offer learning, development, and networking opportunities focused on customer-driven value, innovation, transformation skills, and techniques, and approaches to help colleges and other organizations achieve the long-term sustainability necessary for their survival. AFITHigherEd.com is where you can check them out. AFITHigherEd.com. Welcome back, everybody. It's your time to EdUp on the EdUp Experience podcast, where you know what we do. We make education your business. Dr. Joe Salustio back with you again. I'm excited to announce that Elvin and I are headed back to Anthology Together 2022, AT22, in Orlando, Florida for the Anthology User Conference. It's massive last year when we went, basically during COVID. This year, it's going to be absolutely insane. Of course, we'll be broadcasting live and recording people who are using the Anthology technology, higher ed leaders who will be there. Last year, we put out like 17 episodes in like a day and a half. So we were busy. There was a line, and we're going to do our best to get as many folks and as many voices on this podcast as humanly possible. As much as my voice will carry me and Elvin's production skills will carry him. And we'll see what we can do to give you the what's happening at the Anthology User Conference. AT22 coming up here in July. With me today, I have a first-time guest, and she is doing some amazing work in colleges and universities with strategy and development in all of these areas for employees that are so important as the battle for talent continues to rage on. Here she is, ladies and gentlemen. Her name is Carrie Granger, and she's CEO of Granger Network. Carrie, what is up?
Joe, oh my God, thank you. That was like a huge applause. I thought it was just you on the other end, but it sounds like there's like a couple hundred.
Yeah, no, there's like 50 people in my office right now. Guys, settle down. Settle down. All right, enough of that. Carrie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing? What's going on? And,
oh my goodness.
And, let's just chat.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. This has been a bit of a time coming. I'm enjoying some rainy weather in Toronto. It's not where I live. I live in Denver, Colorado. And,
you live in Denver?
I do live in Denver.
Okay, so wait a minute. So I got to stop you right now. My in-laws live in Denver. I have been in Denver the last 3 weeks. And I'm like, we could have done this in person. Can you imagine?
We could have, but remember, I'm in Toronto.
You're in Toronto right now, but
I'm
you
in
live
Toronto
in Denver.
right now. I live in Denver.
Okay, well, I guess then we wouldn't have done it in person.
We wouldn't have, but next time you go, we can have coffee.
All right, that's fine. So Carrie, level set for us. Talk about the Granger Network. Talk about what you focus on, what your organization does.
Yeah, great. So the Granger Network is a strategic partner for CEOs, presidents, chancellors, executive teams, really. Yeah, so we work across industries, although we do quite a bit of work in higher education. And we're a strategic partner for sustaining and elevating performance during periods of significant transition.
Amazing.
So, it is, thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's why I like about it.
So, in the corporate world, that might be experiencing a cycle of high growth or expansion. a merger acquisition, in a reorganization, which in higher ed, you deal with reorgs as well, dealing with a global pandemic. In higher ed, we often see just transitioning into a state in which you can compete today, right? With all the disruption in higher ed. And then how we do that is we work at the nexus of leadership, culture, and strategy. So what we find is many people will just bring in a leadership development trainer or something like that, or a coach,
right.
Which we're both of those. Or they might bring in culture experts, or they might bring in strategy consultants, right? And what we find is when they're not aligned and there's missing a coherency, they actually can undermine each other. So if you work on leadership, right, but you don't have a culture that can sustain the leadership development goals that you have. So in other words, we unleash an entrepreneurial spirit, but your culture is about conformity, it doesn't work, right? Or if you work,
it gets snuffed out, if you will.
It gets snuffed out, right? And then people, they just kind of get squashed and you end up worse than when you started.
Yikes!
Exactly. That's what we found out because I started in leadership. So we said, oh, okay, we can't just work in leadership. We've got to work on culture. So we start working on culture and that works really well, except if you're missing a strategy and perhaps you say, look, we really need to completely transform the way we do things. We need to become nimble and flexible and that's our strategy. But our culture is, let's create family and, it's not an alignment, right? So the strategy work, the culture work, and the leadership work all go together. And that's why we work there during periods of significant transition. That's our work.
That's very important work. And, you said you work quite a bit in higher education and then you are industry spanning, as it were. Mm-hmm. How does higher ed stack up, right? This is the question. How does higher ed stack up in our, let me think if I want to ask this in a positive or negative way, in our acceptance and willingness to change from what you've seen so far?
How long do we have?
We have as long as it takes. I figured it might go a little longer than our allotted time here as we talk about change in higher ed, because as you know, at this point, blah, 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 coronavirus, catalyst for change, blah, 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 blah. Higher ed, not typically fast. Fast would be the opposite word of what most higher institutions experience. And I say that with love to all my colleagues without higher ed, but we have so many different stakeholder groups, faculty, staff. We like committees and slowness and taking time. And higher ed needs to change like yesterday to both be able to compete and to, ready the workforce for the 21st century. So where do we rank? And what do we need to do from your experience in higher ed to move the ball forward?
Okay, great. That's a huge question, the right question, a great question. And I'm trying to think about the number of kind of rabbit holes we could go down here. So let me start big, and you can respond, and we'll see which direction this goes.
Let's do it.
So yeah, in general, I work a lot in the military as well, and the conditions for the military, the conditions for higher ed, and the conditions for nonprofit and conditions for corporate commercial are really different. And so even how you get your funding matters. So in the corporate arena, there's a sense of urgency and there's a little bit faster feedback on if what you're doing is working. You fire people, unfortunately, faster, or you cut resources faster. So just to make it and stay profitable and stay alive in the corporate world requires a level of urgency that you don't see in the government or higher ed in general, because your funding sources are different, right? I don't work a lot in nonprofit. And I think those really vary. Everybody varies to some degree. So also I'd be interested in terms of private college versus, there's just different categories. So
Yep.
I think the conditions set higher education up in such a way that the urgency is less felt, and people aren't really conditioned that way. So we've enjoyed decades, right? Decades of fairly, until maybe the really last 10 years or so, you might correct me on that, fairly stable culture, right? And the culture and the condition of higher ed allowed for something. It allowed for research over time. You see things like tenure and shared governance. And there's certain things put in place as a solution to something that enabled certain things to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
But then the environment, economic, social, political, this is now an exponential accelerated time, right? And so what we're seeing is that the culture, even the capacities, the way in which colleges try to compete, even who they're competing with, right, has actually shifted. And we're not used to paying as much attention to the economic, political, social, technological changes and adapting like that. Like, we're kind of watching them, but we're not used to exponential times. And so I would say slower to change. I would say that also by protecting, in a way, I might be overstating this, but the freedom to do research and think and be with students, there's a high level of siloedness that.
Yes, that's for sure.
Yeah, so silos aren't always bad. I think breaking down silos doesn't ever really happen, but how do you integrate and link silos? But the siloedness has people not always really paying attention to the bigger picture. And then you have these shared governance models in which not everybody actually has the same context in which they're making decisions. So you have certain structures that are set in place that have higher education be a bit slower. You also have, let me say one more thing, Joe. I heard you take a breath. I would just want to put this.
I'm breathing in because I'm like, I got like 45 questions.
Right? So then the other thing, and we go to work, the work we do begins with working on the condition. We take into account the external condition that I was just speaking about, but the internal, which you can't always do much about, a little bit if you're a game changer, but not really. But it's really the internal condition that you can do something about. And we can talk a little bit about that. I think it's actually critical to helping colleges, universities shift. But there's a kind of shaping that's happened that has people who have grown up in higher education. Not everybody's the same, but there's kind of a disposition. There's a way of being that you do see across the industry. And if you go industry to industry, you can see the differences in kind of a large scale. So there's a practice and a disposition of analysis and a certain way of speaking that doesn't always move things into action, right?
Right.
Batting around ideas, debate is a huge part of this culture, right? And so those things tend to slow it down as well.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, it's like you're describing half my career in higher ed, because I've felt like so much of the competitors within higher ed have been ourselves, internal competition, shared governance, committees. It's like you're always competing against what you hope the outcome, you hope everybody will get to an outcome, but you've got to compete against this time component that's slowing everything down. And, it's like you get, I don't know how many postures there are for people who are going through change, right? Because it is about the human condition and the human transition. But, you kind of either accept the change that comes to you, or or you start freaking out that change is happening around you. And I see that happen a lot. What the heck is going on? Right? So you get this, oh no, what am I going to do? And people then go home and they talk to their spouse about all this change. And that, I always call it like a spouse killer. You know, when you go home, people judge their work situation or their change that's happening around them by going home and talking to their spouse. And the spouse says, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're going through that. This stinks. How much that weighs on us as employees as we have our spouse weigh in on things. And it's very hard to compete with yourself while you're trying to compete externally. How can the Granger Network move institutions through, I don't know if I'm saying getting rid of, but moving quicker toward a shared vision that helps them compete in the marketplace rather than competing internally all the time? Does that question make any sense? If I just ranted for 10 minutes?
No, that is our work. When you know a lot about something, to boil it down into here's the 3 ways, it's difficult. When you don't know a lot about something, it's very easy to make it simple. So I'm going to do my best. So there's a couple things that you've brought up that are critical, and there's some basic ways of understanding human change that I think would just support. I mean, for us, it's just some simple things that make all the difference. You'll notice at the beginning of our conversation, you said, what's the Granger Network about? And I did not say organizational change. I actually said supporting being a strategic partner for organizations going through significant transition. Now, is that just semantics? Maybe it is, but using a different word is really intentional. And if you look at William and Susan Bridges' work on managing transitions, I think everybody should read that book. So change and transitions are 2 different things, and this is the critical difference. So now we're speaking primarily about the culture piece of leadership culture strategy.
Okay, let me get everybody ready to listen. Attention. Okay,
good. So good. So change and transition are not the same thing. Change is about the circumstances changing, new strategy, new IT, new vision, new structure, new initiative. It's what is changing. Usually it's a start. We say, okay, you guys, we're going to make this change. Here's the plan. And now we're going to go execute the plan. Now, what you talked about is as soon as you say that, people freak out. Why? Because of the human psychological transition that is being thrust upon them. It's not just, let's have a new IT system that's going to bring us into the 21st century. This is a great idea. Why don't people get on board? Because there's things at threat. What's at threat are things that are fundamental to them, like being successful, belonging, being known, home, culture.
What about ownership and control?
Ownership and control. Yeah. Did you just, I think my whole identity is about identity. It's really about 2 fundamental things: identity and reality. Did you just shift my reality? Did you just shift my identity? And part of reality is relationships. Did you just shift my relationships? So we worked with one college in which it was really, on paper, a logical thing to do to move this one leadership position that was shared among senior faculty every 3 years. I think it was like in this, I don't want to get the wrong thing, but it was a departmental kind of lead.
Like a funded position, kind of?
Yeah, exactly. And they moved it to a consistent administrative position that was not a faculty member. Okay, well, it made sense on one hand. There's longevity, and then you're not holding your peers accountable. And, it was a solution to one set of things, right? But what they didn't account for is this position was very important to faculty. The fact that they had faculty in that role meant the faculty felt like their cares were in mind, right? And so while change is about the processes, the systems, things like that, transition is about the human psychological process in coming to terms with a change. And most of us haven't been educated on how to deal with the human psychological transition. It's about context. What was that? What was that? Was that like stomach problems?
That's like my mindfulness gong, of self-awareness.
Right. Okay. I get the gong. I get the gong. Yeah. So transition is about addressing fundamental human cares. Do I have a place? Am I needed? Am I going to be successful? Do I see a future for myself that addresses what's important to me? Am I going to be known? How are my relationships changing? That's what the transition is about, and that's where changes go wrong.
Do you think there's a lot of, so if you think about what you just said, am I needed? Is the work I'm doing meaningful? What happens to me if this happens? There's so much trust that has to be there as your leadership communicates what that vision might look like for those changes or those transitions. I'm going to make sure I get the words right, because people have to believe that when you tell them, hey, this thing or process or culture that is going to be in transition, or as humans, you're going to be in transition to this new culture, you have to believe, right? And you have to trust in order to have the right mental, mind space in order to get there. So what do leaders have to do, and where do we miss the mark in bringing people along? Because that is the single hardest thing to do, is to get that coalition of folks really bought in when you're making significant change or transition within an institution.
Yeah, there's kind of two things in that when you asked that question brought up for me, and I want to put a pin in both of them. One is the difference between maybe more of a traditional leadership model, and the other being a stakeholder leadership model. That's one. And I kind of want to put a pin in that to come back to, and especially as it relates to things like shared governance. And then the other thing is, whereas change begins with a start, psychological transitions begin with an end. So we often just start. You
got to say that. You got to say that one more time so that we all hear it, because I was like, wait a minute, what is she saying? And then I'm like, okay, I got it. Say it one more time if you would.
Yeah, I will. So change begins with a start. Let's start this new thing. Let's plan the actions and act. Psychological transitions, the human part of transition, it's not just a journey from one side of the street to another. It's a coming to terms with a new identity and new reality. The psychological transitions begin with an ending.
All right. So my mind is blown, because I think my doctorate degree is in organizational leadership and change. I know it is, but I've never heard anybody put it quite that way before. And you're so right when you just distill it down to those two very simple sentences. And it can change your entire perspective and action set when you think about what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it, right? It's that simple statement you made could change everything.
Yeah, exactly. So the work that we do, and you can become quite good at it. In fact, it's a core capability I recommend.
Are you saying me, Joe, can become quite good at it, or you're saying anybody can? Because if
anybody can, if they learn it, right? And it's a core capability.
It might be a reach for me.
Yeah, but it's needed today, and it doesn't matter if you're in higher ed or anywhere else, but to be able to have a core capability of humans facilitating your humans through change, right? The people who work with you, facilitating that transition is a core capability. So we use a model that begins with end, complete. We do complete, create, commit. Now, if you look at the bridges work, you facilitate an end. An end is about loss, losing, bringing to closure, acknowledging so when we come into work, we have a framework, we call it era work. And when it's a big change, yeah. And it's really about completing the past era. This is like one method from the principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you acknowledge what got accomplished, who did we become, how did we solve problems? And you really do the reflection and create an ending. And you allow yourself to notice, and is there anything I'm losing here? Just like accept that something's coming to an end. What never got worked out? And by doing that work, which by the way, requires a certain kind of listening, that's not like problem solving listening, we can come back to that, is really listening for completion. When somebody is emptied out in a way, but complete, tied up, when things are acknowledged, this is ending, there's space to create something new. That's why we say complete, create. Now the create side, now I'll go into stakeholder leadership for a moment. The create side, you said earlier, how do you tell people here's the change and get on board? And, that I always say the mouth tells on the brain. The mouth tells on the way the brain is looking, perceiving, thinking, right? So the way that, and that's the question I get all the time, how do I get people on board? Which, by the way, speaks to a certain kind of condition in the leadership that is why shared governance sometimes doesn't work, right? But again, I'll put a pin in that. So the stakeholder leadership it's not just create, it's co-create. Co-create, meaning that a stakeholder leader co-creates a future that addresses the fundamental cares of the stakeholders. So it's not like it has to go my way, but in this future, I can see three things in this co-created future. I can see that this future addresses what's of fundamental importance to me. I'm not saying it's my solution or opinion or the way I say it has to go, but what's underneath that? What's my real care underneath that? That it addresses what's fundamentally important to me. That's one. Number two, I can be recognized and I can make a noteworthy contribution and be recognized for that. That's why I want to say it. I can make a noteworthy contribution to this future and be, recognized for it. So this future addresses addresses what's important to me. I can make a noteworthy contribution to the success of this or to where we're going with this. And then the third one is it allows me to be about something bigger than myself. It's an identity enhancement. It's bold, it's big, it's like it has me be part of something bigger. So oftentimes we'll create changes. We need to go to this new IT system, it's kind of bland. We don't do the work of, how do each of the stakeholders' fundamental cares get addressed in this future? How can they each contribute to the success of that? And then how does this support something that's bigger than themselves? So that's the create. Yeah, so there's complete, there's create, which is really co-create. Then there's commit. And that's when we get real agreements, clear agreements, moving forward in action. So again, in change, you just announce a change and then you go right to action. This is another place that I find higher education, because we're used to thinking about things, discussing things. We have a lot of committees around things. Making clear agreements, getting into action is not, I'd say, as honed as maybe some other industries. I'm saying that nicely.
Very nice way.
Yeah, like we're not great at that. And in fact, one of the fundamental I call them distinctions that we provide that make the biggest difference in higher education is just teaching the leaders the difference between language that describes, which is what we're really good at. It's opinions, explanations, analysis, debates, reflections. That's called a descriptive use of language. And that's really useful in the complete stage. Then there's the creative kind of language, is more visionary. This is what's possible. It's kind of big picture thinking, but that's still not commitment, right? But it's like, oh, what about this? And we can, and we should, and we're going in this direction. It's more possibility, creative kind of language. And then there's commitment-based language, which is, I promise to do X by Y date. Here's my proposal. I request that. I promise. I propose. And so just training people how to use I propose versus, well, so-and-so, and it doesn't work for me, which is really is more descriptive use, right? So by teaching people how to speak, complete, create, commit, it begins to move. Okay, I said a ton of stuff, Joe.
It's no secret that there are considerable challenges facing higher education right now. The teaching and learning methods of the past are becoming obsolete, and time-worn processes have all but lost their effectiveness. No longer will the take no action or move forward with incremental change mindsets sustain operations. Colleges are closing their doors at an alarming rate, and some are teetering on the edge of existence. It's time to join the Alliance for Innovation and Transformation, better known as AFIT. Check them out at afithighered.com. That's AFIT highered.com. If you want to be at the forefront of technology and innovation in education, it's time to look at AFIT. Well, I'm mesmerized by the way you talk about it, because I'm like way into like self-reflection right now. And I'm like, oh God, I should have done that better. Oh God, I should have said that better. I'm sure there's people listening to this that are like, okay, I see why. You think about when you're going through and you're trying to help create transition for a team to achieve some type of future state. How you get to those underlying needs, and why I would guess you've been so successful in your career as you come in as a third party consultant is because not every employee may be willing to, divulge what is underneath to, the person who's making the change, for example, or to their supervisor, because maybe there's fear there, or maybe the fear of change itself is manifested into somebody who's not willing to say what they feel because of there's just concerns.
Fear of retribution. What's going to happen with my job?
Retaliation, everything.
Yeah.
So, do you just, do you have clients come to you and hire it and say, look, I've got this, I've got that. And then you go in as the third party and you're like, here's really the issues. And the leaders are going, oh, because I just imagine an employee not saying what they really think in some situations.
Yeah, not saying it to the right person. I'll say it in the bathroom or the water cooler, or, to
their spouse
who agree, or the spouse. But it's, oh my goodness. Okay, this is so rich. Oh my God, it's so rich, this conversation. And your question.
It's because of you, not because of me.
I like to say things are co-sourced, like you got good listening. If
thank
good
you for
things
that very
are
passive
said.
comment. Yeah, very passive compliment.
Compliment, yeah. No, it was good. Yeah, I mean, if people say good things in your presence, if you have a lot of brilliant people around you, Joe, it's about your listening.
And that's what I try to do. Yeah, put smarter people around you, right?
But your listening brings out the genius in others. That's a key piece of all this, by the way, is the way we listen.
I like it. So tell me about that piece, though, the employee divulging their feelings.
It has to do with the way we listen too, right? So a couple things. Let me come back to listening, possibly, if I remember to. Mostly people do hire us, right? Because they need to make a big change, or there's something, so they're ambitious, they're doing great, and they have a big change. They understand it's difficult to have people move with them, and they really grasp the gravity of it and the significance of it. And And by the way, we're touching almost entirely on culture right now, but strategy is a big piece of it, and learning how to lead differently is a big piece of it as well, right? But I like that we're focused on culture now. I think it's useful to just stay here. I just want to say that those two pieces go hand in hand.
Maybe there's a part 2 podcast here, Kari.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So with that, we usually get hired for that reason, or we're stuck. We're in an eddy. We know we can get better, but we don't know how. And generally speaking, those are the situations where you really got to get people divulged. But oftentimes where they think the problem is not actually where the problem is. And I said earlier, the co-sourcing thing, it's what's happening between us. It's always that, right? So if I'm coming and I'm listening to you from, and I hear this a lot in the work that we do, what's the problem to be solved? What's going to happen, Joe, is you're going to end up telling me your problems, and I'm either going to go to work solving them, therefore abdicating you of the responsibility and power to solve your own problems, or I'm going to listen to you like, what a complainer, or, I can't do anything about it anymore. Why does Joe always have a problem? Right? So there's this kind of slant in all of our listening. The negative kind of cynical slant. We all have this default way of listening. Mine sounds kind of like, I'm busy, hurry up, get to the point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which will have you actually fumble over your words, speak really rapidly, and try to bottom line something. You're not going to bring nuance to me.
Have you bugged my room? Have you bugged my office? Why are you describing me on this podcast? I thought we said we would not do that, Kari.
Oh my God. Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, sometimes I speak and listen at the same time.
Yeah, apparently so.
But that's what happens. So that's why I know if I'm saying useful things, it's a function of your listening. So there's kind of this, it's a subjective space we start to master, right? And this is that subjective space. So if you're listening, and let's just talk about our partners, right? So if we go, the people that we live with, we all kind of have a way of listening to them, and that way of listening, we think what they're saying is about them. It is, but it's co-sourced by the way we listen. So you go out and you practice. Listen for, do I agree or disagree? And that happens in academia a lot. Do I agree with this? Do I disagree with this? What's the alternate point of view? What haven't they thought of? How are they trying to screw me? This is unfair.
Unintended consequences.
What are the unintended consequences? Okay, that allows for one kind of conversation, which is why you see the same conversation happening in all the halls. It's a way of listening. So people hire us. They think they're hiring us to say great things and to help them, like tell them what to do. That's not at all what we do.
False.
Exactly. Exactly. They hire us to listen. And they don't know they're hiring us to listen. So we're listening from, we're listening. What are we listening for? We're listening for the underlying condition that's going to have things show up the same way over and over again. That's at an organizational level. At an individual level, we're listening for their world, their experience, their fundamental cares. What's possible in what they're saying. There's very trained, these are all different ways of listening. This is a very trained way of listening. And so let me go back to the condition. When we come in, we're listening for what's the condition, what's the environment in which the results are occurring. For example, people might say there's a lack of transparency around here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, if you hire McKinsey or somebody, that's what you're going to pay them a lot of money, and they're going to tell you that. But what they're not going to hear is what's the condition that leads to lack of transparency year after year, even though we all want it to be different and commit to being different. What's that condition? In one college, we found that there was this unspoken question, and we got it in by listening very deeply. How will this information get used against me?
Yeah, you ever heard, and I've heard and I've had it happen to me actually, where I personally have been more transparent than anybody could have ever been in the situation I was in some of my previous roles, and someone would still say it. Like, there's not enough transparency. And I go, what do you mean? I've just laid out everything.
Yeah.
And so much of it is tied up in how you communicate and what you communicate. But sometimes those statements don't go away no matter what you do, because they're almost historical.
Yes, they're inherited. They're inherited interpretations. And so we go to work on that. Okay, so a condition. What's a condition? It's the environment in which results occur. And the environment in which results occur is vital to the kinds of results that can occur. It's akin to the listening, right? So if you're listening for, what is this, are you going to take advantage of me? What does this have to do with me? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Hurry up, get to the point. You're not trying to screw me, are you? If you're listening for that, there's only one kind of conversation. You can't speak into that very long. The corollary is on the organizational level, right? So the kind of environment in which your results are occurring is vital to the kind of results that can occur. It's like a stick dropped into a river. If you drop a stick in the river, it's going to go in the direction of the river, the drift. It's kind of like a drift, right? Yep. So you throw a new policy into the river, it's going to go downstream. You throw an invitation to collaborate into the river, it's going to go downstream. You throw an open and honest conversation into the river, it's going to go downstream. So you got to address the condition, you got to address the direction the river's going.
Boy, this is a mind-blowing conversation, Kari. And since we haven't talked about strategy, I would like to have you back for a part 2 to talk about strategy, because that is obviously the missing piece, right? When culture is so powerful though, right? And we talk about culture and the human condition and what affects a culture and what doesn't. Every single person listening to this phone call, I guarantee you, has gone through some level of self-reflection right now. I mean, I do want to ask you kind of what we ask our guests on every episode, our final 2 questions to wrap up what we'll say is part 1 here of culture and strategy with Granger Network. Number 1, what did we not say about the Granger Network that you would like to say? Anything that you have going on, events, speaking engagements, website, you get to plug your company as best you can. And then secondarily to that, what do you see as the future of higher education? But add the term leadership on the end. What do you see as the future of higher ed leadership?
So our website, I'll do the easy one first, is grangerNetwork.com. Granger, like Hermione Granger, not like the Granger farm store.
Got it.
GrangerNetwork.com. And I do have a podcast. I have 3 seasons of a podcast I did a couple years ago. It's called The Leadership Impact. And it was done by myself and my co-host, Paul Adams. Wow. That, some of these topics are talked about. So it may be it's a easy, free resource you can dive into further. Awesome. So that might be useful. I'd like to say that a long time ago, we stopped doing things that were like the stick dropped in the river. So, we're not, while we do some speaking engagements, we've done a lot of convocation keynotes, things like that, about change, about all sorts of things. And that's a good use of us. But really who we look for, we don't want to just do a one-day workshop, because it's just not going to make the change. who we look for are people who want to be strategic partners, who, they want us to be their partner over time. They're ready to play pro ball, not recreational or high school ball. They want to play pro ball. They're willing
I like
to,
that.
yeah, they're willing to take themselves on. They're willing to look and say, you know what? We're the executives. We're the top. We're the ones who are accountable for this condition. And it starts with us. So they're willing to look inward. They're willing to put in the hard yards and then to truly engage people across the college, the campus, the institution, where.
So don't call KG, aka
University.
Carrie Granger, if you're playing JV. You got to be playing pro ball.
Exactly, because it's hard work. It's introspective. It's hard work. It's changing patterns. It's seeing like, oh my God, we created shared governance as a solution to inclusion, but we have no desire to get their opinions. We think they just bog down the decision-making process. And that's why it's not working. Oh my God, we just created this whole shared governance model and we haven't clarified voice, vote, and veto.
Yikes.
We got to go back and do it. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard work and It's fun working with us, but it's, it's like really people who are committed to making the changes. And it's usually, honestly, it's a couple of years in working together. So it's a partnership. That's the people we look for. Okay.
Future of higher education leadership.
One of the things that I find interesting is corporate America is interested in military metaphors. Military is often, not always, but often interested in corporate metaphors. Higher education, again, I don't want to stereotype, but those that we've worked with the exception of one, has kind of an antibody to business speak. And that's not true of everybody. I know it's not, but I find that there's kind of some tissue rejection.
100%.
Yeah.
Totally true.
And so they're missing out because higher education now needs to compete. You have new competitors. I know in the community college space, which is different, this is a unique market. First of all, I've been calling it a market. I know it's hard for people to hear, but you're competing with, you're not so much competing with each other. You're competing with the forces that would dissuade students from attending. The $20 an hour job. You're competing. You're competing with Amazon and Google and corporate. Walmart has go to education within, right? I believe, don't they? Uh-huh. We just got asked. We have a national restaurant brand that couldn't get the education and the training that they need. They hired us to create a university for them. But if the community colleges around them were paying attention and they were competing, like they have to learn how to be more entrepreneurial and learn how to sell and create relevant offers for their potential students, clients, customers. Maybe who their clients are different. They're now competing in a way. Why are we getting the contract to develop a university when they're a university? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because good for you, but shame on whoever, right?
Yeah, because they're not nimble enough. They're not paying attention to the market, but they have to compete in the market because there have been new market entrants that are offering relevancy, customization, timeliness, different costs. So I believe that higher education has to relax their shields in a way to say, okay, what is this tissue rejection really about? We want to preserve a certain academic freedom and get down to that fundamental care. So how do you have that and compete in the marketplace so that you're alive, so that you survive, that you're around. So before, the threat, that there wasn't really an existential threat to higher education. There was to businesses. There was certain urgency about change. There's now an existential threat, which means that they've got to compete differently. And that goes into our strategy conversation, which perhaps is part 2.
Wow. Well, I will tell you what, you are so right on. I couldn't have said it better myself with higher ed's shield when it comes to business language like sales and product and service and so on. Speaking of great business and a great person, I'd like to just give a shout out to the executive director of the Alliance for Innovation and Transformation, Erica Leodis, who introduced Carrie and I. And AFIT, of course, is doing great work with their member institutions to bring transformation into education in a more rapid fashion. And so shout out to Erica for bringing Carrie to me and getting us hopefully 2 parts of what I would say is one of my favorite all-time conversations on this podcast because of the depth and the necessity and the lack of focus sometimes that we put on understanding the human condition when it comes to change and transition. Carrie, you've put an incredible spotlight on it. Thank you. And how was your EdUp experience today? Did you have a good time at least?
Oh my God, I had a great time. Thank you. And can I give a shout out to AFIT as well?
Of course.
The Alliance for Innovation and Transformation. I wouldn't have been in the higher education space much if I hadn't been asked to do a keynote there. And from there, I got about 4 years ago, really introduced and had to really learn higher education in a way that I hadn't before. And so I've been back there, and I want to say a couple of things because of what you said. They bring in thought leaders and organizations outside of higher education. So you get exposed to different ideas, which is really what's needed, right? Like popping that insular bubble. They're an association that does that. They also, what I love about them is they create a team learning environment. So you don't just go to their summits and their conferences by yourself, which rarely, then it puts all the burden on you, right? The CEOs and presidents, they bring their teams. And so then that supports a cultural shift because you're all in it together, right? And then there's this huge network of, okay, is competing as your own institution, but then also learning from each other. So I just want to say that the things that we talked about today, AFIT really provides for their members some relevancy to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and their summer session is coming up. AFIT's summer session in Nashville, the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of July. If you're a learning partner or you're a member of an institution, you get to go and exchange ideas. And I know actually last year I was able to talk and do some episodes remotely with some of the learning partners. And the insights coming out of there are the innovative insights that higher ed needs to hear and act upon in order to get better. One person that gets better every time she speaks is my guest today. Her name is Carrie Granger, and she's CEO of the Granger Network. Carrie, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've just EdUp'd. The Alliance for Innovation and Transformation is an alliance of pacesetters, forward-thinking higher education CEOs committed to leading by example to show other higher education institutions how to innovate and transform their organizations in the face of unprecedented challenge and change. They offer learning, development, and networking opportunities focused on customer-driven value, innovation, transformation skills, and techniques, and approaches to help colleges and other organizations achieve the long-term sustainability necessary for their survival. AFITHigherEd.com is where you can check them out. AFITHigherEd.com.